Title: The Gibsonville Gauntlet. Author: M. Marie Smith. Chapter title: Wilbur and the Legless Ghost. Chapter number: 7th. And that's how they make 'em. They put ducks in with beavers, see, and out come these things. Think they're from Africa or summit. Platypus, they're called. Wilbur stood in the center of the painted pony, with a beer in one hand and his flat cap pulled low. His shoulders curled inward, but his round face carried the grave authority of a man delivering official news. Not a man inventing zoology before a saloon full of half-drunk Kansans. "What utter balderdash," Cecil said. He sat at the nearest table, one leg crossed with precision over the other, his pipe balanced between two fingers. His expression held the pinched suffering of a man afflicted by an illness no physician could diagnose and no medicine could touch. He didn't raise his voice. Raising it would have meant he still believed Wilbur could be saved. The painted pony ran hot that night. Hot enough to wilt collars, dampen hairlines, and fog the windows, while the darkness outside kept its winter teeth. Coal oil lamps smoked over the bar and card tables, their jaundiced light cutting ragged circles through the haze. Whiskey, beer, damp wool, pipe smoke, hair tonic, boot grease, wet leather, old sweat, and the sour sting of the spittoons crowded the air. One by one, the men began to listen. A freighter, with road dust crusted in his beard, held his glass halfway to his mouth. A fellow in a checked waistcoat leaned against the bar, already grinning. Near the stove, 2 cattlemen let a horse trade die unfinished. A thin printer with ink beneath his nails turned his chair around and folded his arms over its back. Wilbur paid no mind to Cecil. Contradiction had never stopped him. It wasn't a wall or even a stone in the road. It was weather, and Wilbur had always been willing to walk through weather. But like I always say, do we need 'em? Same as seals. Whale dogs, them. Half whale, half dog, do. No. I've explained this before, Deputy. Do we truly need? A seal is not whale dogs and beaver ducks. Then there's them bugs what look like leaves. They. Deputy, for the love of God and every angel in heaven, shut up. Cecil shot forward. His chair legs scraped hard across the floorboards, and his pipe came up like a pistol. His brows lifted with the terrible resolve of an educated man called upon to defend civilization itself from the threat of a beaver duck. He opened his mouth. The room got there first. Laughter rolled down the bar. The man in the checked waistcoat barked into his drink and slapped the counter. Samantha covered her mouth, though her eyes gave her away. Even Nick, balanced carelessly on the back legs of his chair, let out a quick laugh before pressing it into a grin. Cecil drew hard on his pipe, stirring the tobacco to a faint red beneath the ash. Smoke gathered around him in thick, indignant clouds, nearly concealing the bleak shape of a scholar condemned to teach in a schoolhouse run by goats. Wilbur looked pleased, but not proud. He hadn't been putting on a show. He had simply followed his thought wherever it chose to wander. If the thought dragged half the saloon behind it, that was hardly his responsibility. He drank, wiped the foam from his upper lip, then nodded as if he'd completed a learned address. Right. Got another one for you? Cecil went perfectly still. Wilbur leaned closer. It's about a ghost. I love ghost stories. Samantha's voice warmed with interest as she leaned toward him. Right, Miss Ashford. But this ain't only a story. It's true. It happened. Wilbur spoke with the solemn force of a preacher announcing Judgment Day and expecting the clouds to split on cue. Cecil lowered his pipe. He didn't strike it against the table, but the motion carried the final weight of a judge's gavel descending on reason. His eyes shut. His shoulders rose, as though the last sound thread holding his patience together had finally begun to snap. Mother of God! The painted pony changed around him. A card moved more slowly over green felt. A drink hovered near a man's lips. One of the cattlemen stepped away from the stove. Nick allowed his chair to drop onto all four legs and reached for his glass, smiling the way he always did when trouble came without bullets and could therefore be enjoyed. Wilbur remained standing, beer in hand. It was his first of the day, and the one Hawk gave him free for wearing a badge. Gibsonville had 2 lawmen, but Wilbur was the only one shameless enough to claim the privilege. His flat cap shaded his earnest face, and he wore the peculiar gravity of a witness preparing to swear before a court. He didn't merely look ready to speak. He looked ready to be helpful. To Cecil. That was the worst part. "I don't remember all the details, but—" Wilbur began. "That has never impeded you before, Deputy." Cecil removed his spectacles and pinched the bridge of his nose. "By all means, continue." The words were dry enough to pull moisture from the air. Wilbur nodded in gratitude, missing the blade hidden inside the courtesy. Or perhaps he saw it, and had simply decided not to bleed. With Wilbur, either explanation remained possible. Cecil settled back and attempted detachment. He failed with remarkable thoroughness. Every line of his body remained engaged against his will. The rigid mouth, the lifted chin, the pipe clenched between his teeth like the final restraint keeping him from rising, taking Wilbur by the shoulders, and demanding a full retraction of every zoological crime committed that evening. "Tell us then," Nick said. Wilbur took another swallow and stared into the middle distance, searching for the facts. The middle distance did not seem eager to provide them. His gaze traveled beyond Nick's shoulder, past the smoking lamp and the cloudy mirror behind the bottles, into the private storeroom of his mind. That was where newspaper oddities, tavern gossip, half-heard rumors, and facts remembered wrong all lived together in perfect peace. His fingers tapped twice against the glass, then stopped. Somewhere in that crowded storeroom, something had apparently raised its hand. "Right, ages ago." "When?" Cecil asked. "Literally ages ago? Decades, or—" "Ages, just ages. There was this woman living in a big house down south." Cecil waited. "South of where?" "Manchester. Somewhere round the Midlands." Cecil shifted the pipe from one corner of his mouth to the other. "South of Manchester. Somewhere in the Midlands. Right. Proceed." The word carried the exhausted dignity of a judge, allowing testimony inadmissible in every civilized court. "Anyway, she died." An unforeseen development in a ghost story. Wilbur nodded, because death was important to the account, and Cecil had apparently caught up. Years later, this family bought the place. One night, they're having their tea, and this woman walks across the dining room. Old-fashioned dress and that, but they can only see her down to her knees. Rest of her goes into the floor. Samantha lowered her beer, her eyes brightening. "It's already good." At the far end of the bar, a man still disputed his credit with Hawk. Wilbur's certainty caught the rest of the room, only during lulls in their own talk. Nick glanced at the boards beneath his chair. "Like she was sunk in it?" "Yeah." "Walking normal, just through the boards, like wading through waist-deep water." Nick leaned toward Samantha and echoed the last word under his breath. "What?" laying Wilbur's broad Lancashire pronunciation on, twice as thick. Wilbur made 2 fingers walk through spilled beer on the tabletop. "Or," Cecil said, "the apparition, if apparition it was reputed to walk at the level of an earlier floor. It is a common embellishment in such tales." "That's what they thought." Cecil's mouth remained open. Agreement had caught him unprepared. For one rare instant, hope touched his face. An earlier floor. Architectural alteration. Folklore embroidered by retelling. Foolishness certainly, but foolishness bounded by recognizable laws. The hope did not survive. "She did it every night," Wilbur said. "Same time. Came through that wall, crossed the dining room, went toward the window, then disappeared. Just once. Never saw her again till next night." Nick caught the flicker of hope on Cecil's face, and smiled into his glass. "One of the boards broke later on," Wilbur continued, "and under it, they found the old stone floor, about that much lower." He held his hands apart at a distance beginning near a foot and growing toward 2, and the distance corresponded to the portion of the figure hidden beneath the boards. Cecil asked. "Right, about 18 inches. Was it 18 inches? Did it say so in your source?" "Near enough." "Near enough for what? Architecture? Anatomy? The supernatural?" "Well, it matched, didn't it? So they reckoned if they took the wooden floor up, next time she came through, they'd see all of her." Cecil's fingers tightened around the pipe stem. "They removed the dining room floor to improve their view of a ghost." "Boards were rotten anyway." "Were they?" "Bit damp." Nick looked over his glass. "Was that detail in whatever you read?" "Must have been. They wouldn't take a good floor up, would they?" Cecil stared at Wilbur with the expression of a man contemplating a globe stripped of borders, place names, and lines of latitude and longitude, every fixed point of reference. In Wilbur's world, floorboards became rotten exactly when a ghost required narrative assistance. Evidence arrived after the verdict and stood wherever it was told. "So, they take all the boards up," Wilbur said. "Next night she comes out the wall like usual, but now she's stuck." He delivered this development with grave certainty, one hand around his beer, and the other resting flat on the table, as though steadying the facts against Cecil's continued interference. Samantha nodded, as though it were the soundest thing she'd heard all evening. "See? That's what happens. Remove your floorboards, and your ghost gets stuck." Cecil looked at her. It was a long, wounded stare, made worse by the suspicion that she was enjoying herself far too much to be reasoned with. Samantha met it innocently, the corners of her mouth twitching. "Stuck where?" Nick asked. "In the air. Same height she'd always been, only there weren't any floor under her now." Nick lowered his glass and glanced toward the hazy space above the floorboards, trying to picture it. "And what was she doing?" "Trying to walk. Couldn't go anywhere. Her little stumps were just going back and forth." "Her what?" Cecil asked incredulously. "Her stumps. Her stumps." Heads turned, not toward Wilbur, but toward Cecil. The room sensed something important had happened. Wilbur set down his beer and held 2 fingers above the table, wagging them uselessly. "Little stumps. Like this." "Stop doing that, Deputy." Cecil's voice came low and controlled, the way a man might speak to someone carrying a lighted match through a powder magazine. Wilbur stopped. "Turns out she'd had both legs off." Samantha pressed a hand to her chest in mock horror. "How terrible. Then how had she crossed the room before?" "It were just the right height. Gave her stump summit to push against." Cecil's pipe had gone out. He sat perfectly still, the dead stem between his teeth, searching for a response that would not require him to overturn the table. The spectre required traction. Everyone does. Cecil's hand tightened around the dead pipe. "A ghost has no weight." Wilbur considered Cecil's objection with the patience of a man willing to help another through a difficult idea. "That's why she was stuck up there in it. Her little stumps couldn't reach the floor once they'd lowered it." Nick's laugh escaped before he could lower his glass. Whiskey ran over his knuckles. "He's got you there, Cecil!" Laughter rippled outward. Cecil did not join it. He looked from Wilbur to Nick, to the room, a scholar watching an entire saloon vote against an immutable law of nature. "No, Deputy, no." Cecil removed the pipe from his mouth. If she possessed no weight, she could exert no force against the floor. Didn't need much. More of a shuffle. Samantha glanced at Cecil, then turned back to Wilbur with a look of perfect innocence. "Wait. I'm confused. How did she get around when she was alive?" "Miss Ashford, don't," Cecil began. "False legs," Wilbur said. "They found 'em in the attic, said Lily on 'em. Cecil's eyes narrowed. The legs, said Lily. Not out loud, painted on, or maybe etched or summat. Lily, right. Lily. Cecil repeated. The legless ghost. The revelation settled over the table. Nick and Samantha turned towards Cecil. Cecil's gaze crawled toward the ceiling. Perhaps he sought divine intervention. Perhaps he merely wished to confirm that the roof remained overhead, and that at least one structural principle in the universe had not yet been put to a vote. Around them, the laughter ebbed. Cecil said nothing. Any question he asked would only make the labeled spectral prostheses more detailed. Wilbur mistook the silence for permission. Anyway, they put new boards in at the old height. Soon as the floor were back, she were off again. Nick knew perfectly well what Wilbur meant. He asked anyway, because Cecil's expression suggested the experiment required only one final drop. Off where? Toward the window, like before. Cecil leaned forward, the dead pipe pinched between two fingers like evidence. So this family removed its dining room floor, discovered a legless ghost stranded in mid-air, and then rebuilt the floor at precisely the former height so that she could shuffle across it upon her spectral stumps. His voice rose with every clause, until spectral stumps rang through the painted pony like the final charge in an indictment. Even the piano player stopped playing, which was the first time anyone had noticed there was a piano player at all. Wilbur considered the summary. Not long. Only enough to be fair. Well, they couldn't leave her stuck there. That wouldn't be right. She was dead. Cecil slapped a palm to his forehead. Oh, Jove, what on earth am I saying? I've become so accustomed to his nonsense that I'm accepting the existence of a legless ghost dangling in space. The painted pony broke apart. Nick doubled over his glass, Samantha collapsed against the table, and even Hawk turned away, shoulders jumping behind the counter. Wilbur waited until the laughter loosened enough for words. Still had places to be, didn't she? Anyway, this. Where did you read this masterpiece? Wilbur reached into his back pocket, pulled out a crumpled clipping, and laid it on the table like a trump card turned face up. This was in the Illustrated Police News. He nudged it towards Cecil with quiet confidence. Here, at last, was the moment where Cecil read the evidence and admitted that Wilbur had been right all along. Cecil stared at him, then lowered his gaze to the article. Ah. He nodded slowly and gravely, as though receiving evidence that required him to reconsider his entire position. Forgive me, my error entirely. I had taken this tale for a preposterous pile of shit. I had no notion it was chronicled in the August pages of the Illustrated Police News, an organ which has never once, in all its distinguished history, stooped to exaggeration or the sensational invention of a single fact. Give me that. Wilbur handed it over readily, watching Cecil with the patient expectation of a man awaiting vindication. Cecil rose, tore the clipping into several pieces, and crossed to the stove. He opened the iron door, and fed the scraps into the fire, one by one. The paper curled black at the edges, flared, and vanished among the coals. Wilbur watched it burn. His eyebrows lifted, but only briefly. He had expected Cecil to read the article, not destroy it, though the disappointment settled into resignation, almost at once. Cecil returned to the table, sat, put the pipe between his teeth, and drew. Nothing. He glared at the dead bowl, with the weary resentment of a man betrayed by his last dependable companion. Then he struck a match, and relit it. Cecil closed his eyes, and rubbed his temples, suffering magnificently. A stranger might have pitied him. Nick and Samantha were beginning to know better. For all his near-constant annoyance, Cecil could never leave Wilbur's nonsense alone. Every time one of the stories threatened to expire, he supplied the next question and hauled it back to life. Dr. Holliday, Cecil said without opening his eyes, I beg of you, sir. An inquiry, if you would be so kind as to indulge me. At the nearest poker table, The long, fair-haired man kept his attention on the cards fanned in his hand. His coat hung open far enough to show that he had not entered the Painted Pony, trusting entirely to good manners. "Doc will do, Mr. Wainwright," the fair-haired man said, still studying his cards. Kate sat beside him, leaning back in her chair with one hand near her whiskey and a cigarette burning between two fingers. Dark-haired, sharp-faced and watchful, she had already taken the measure of every man in the room, and found perhaps 3 worth remembering. "Then Doc it shall be." Cecil opened one eye, just far enough to make certain he had an audience, then closed it again. "You are a man trained in the medical arts. Tell me, sir, am I in danger of apoplexy?" Kate answered before Doc so much as raised his eyes from his cards. "Where I come from, Mr. Wainwright, foolish talk never killed a man. If it did, every tavern in Hungary would be a graveyard." Doc's mouth moved at one corner. He set an unlit cigarette between his lips. Kate leaned toward him, bringing their faces close as she touched its tip to the glowing end of hers. He drew until the tobacco caught, then released a thin stream of smoke through his nose, his attention never quite leaving the game. "To say nothing of our venerable United States Congress," Doc added. Samantha watched over the rim of her beer. Kate drank whiskey, smoked cigarettes, answered questions meant for Doc, and leaned close to him in a crowded saloon without so much as glancing around to see who might disapprove. Samantha had known women in St. Louis who did one or another of those things, though never so openly, and certainly never all at once. What kind of woman was she? Kate's gaze shifted across the room. It passed over Samantha's carefully dressed hair, the fine clothes belonging to a life that no longer quite fit, and the beer held between her hands before returning to her face. The look was brief, but not careless. Samantha had the odd sense of having been asked the same question. Doc gathered his cards into one hand, picked up his whiskey with the other, and took a measured sip. Laughter rolled easily through the room, warm with liquor and smoke. Even the 2 men sharing the table with Doc smiled down at their cards, though neither seemed to have found the joke particularly amusing. Ned Bailey did not. He had the heavy neck and shoulders of a man accustomed to taking up more space than he needed, and a thick mustache that drew attention to the anger fixed around his mouth. He might once have been handsome, perhaps still was. When viewed from far enough away, up close, the temper had worn through. He watched the ash lengthen on Holliday's cigarette, as though Doc were growing it there to spite him. A red chip moved beneath his thumb, forward and back, forward and back. When it stopped against the first knuckle, the man on his right pushed another coin into the pot. His gaze remained on the chip. He never consulted his cards. The chip was giving orders. Its position told Bailey's companions whether to remain in the hand, withdraw, or feed more money into the pot. Bailey was directing 3 hands, not merely playing one. "Mrs. Holliday," Cecil said. Kate's gaze touched Doc's across the narrow distance between them. His met hers, held for no more than an instant, then returned to the hand. They had signed the Gibson House register as Dr. and Mrs. J. H. Holliday, because it suited them to do so. Gibsonville, just as Dodge City had a few weeks before, had politely accepted the respectable fiction. Cecil continued, "I find your reassurance medically imprecise, but socially devastating." Kate's mouth curved as she settled more comfortably in her chair, cigarette balanced between 2 fingers. "Then I call it good medicine." Doc looked toward Cecil at last. The attorney had arranged himself in an attitude of wounded dignity, eyes nearly closed, one hand loose against his waistcoat. The performance would have been flawless, but for the small flash of amusement beneath his lowered lids. Doc caught it. So did Kate. He drew once on his cigarette, turned his head, and coughed into a folded handkerchief. The cough came dry and sharp, tightening his shoulders before it passed. He opened the linen just enough to examine it, found it clean, and folded it away with the same care he gave his cards. "Teeth are my trade, Mr. Wainwright, but I know enough of the head to tell you yours is not presently bursting." Pity. You are merely annoyed, sir. Clearly. And theatrical, Kate said. Cecil turned toward her, one hand rising to his breast, as though she had put a bullet through his heart, rather than a pin through his dignity. Madam, you wound me. Kate glanced at Samantha and winked. You see? He's doing it again. Samantha looked from Kate to Cecil, lost control of her smile, and bent over her beer before it became anything less respectable. Wilbur, untouched by irony, and grateful for any diagnosis that did not involve immediate death, brightened. See, Mr. Wainwright? Doc says you're all right. You won't drop dead, Mr. Wainwright, Kate said, drawing on her cigarette. That is unfortunate, Cecil said. Dropping dead would be preferable to listening to more of Deputy Brett's nonsense about spectral amputees, duck-beaver hybrids, and marine whale dogs. Doc lowered his gaze to his cards again. Nothing in his face suggested he had been following anything but Cecil's complaint. Only the slow movement of his thumb along the card edges showed he remained in the hand at all. I wouldn't advise it, sir. Dropping dead in company is generally considered poor manners. In a saloon, it becomes a public inconvenience. Somebody would be obliged to move you. The red chip stopped. Kate's eyes dropped once to Bailey's thumb, then met Doc's. The man on Bailey's left threw his cards face down, surrendering the hand before Bailey's thumb had fully lifted. The man on his right matched the wager without consulting his cards. One got out of Bailey's way, the other fed more money into the pot. Neither decision had anything to do with the cards he held. Bailey leaned forward. Heat had climbed his neck and settled darkly above his collar. God damn it, Holliday! The growl was meant for the table, but it carried. You planning to finish that hand before that cigarette burns down? Conversation thinned around them. It did not stop. Not quite, but softened beneath the scrape of a chair and the clink of a glass set down too carefully. Behind the bar, Hawk lifted his head. His hands remained below the counter, his attention fixed on Bailey. Kate leaned across Doc to reach the ashtray beside his hand. She moved with the casual possession of a woman who had crossed that space 1,000 times and expected no man to object. Her forearm passed between Bailey and Doc's cards, and for an instant the fall of her sleeve concealed Doc's hand clear to the wrist. She tapped her cigarette against the tray. The ash did not fall. Beneath her sleeve, Doc's smallest finger slid one card into his cuff. His thumb drew another out and admitted it into his hand before Kate settled back into her chair. Bailey followed the movement from her wrist to Doc's hand. The man on his left glanced at Bailey, then quickly lowered his eyes. Kate held the cigarette between two fingers, her expression easy, almost bored. Doc let Bailey's demand sit, the way a man lets a dog bark itself out. He took another sip of whiskey, set the glass down exactly where it had been, and returned his full attention to the cards as though no one had spoken. Call. Doc matched Bailey's final wager. The betting was over, and the 5-card hands came face up, one at a time. Bailey spread 4 aces across the table, then laid down a king beside them. A murmur moved through the men gathered near enough to see. It held none of the surprise such a hand ought to have earned. Bailey's companions showed even less. The man on his left looked first to Bailey, not the cards. The other had already fixed his attention on the pot, his hand resting near its edge, as though the division of it were the only business remaining. Kate drew on her cigarette and studied Bailey through the smoke. One corner of her mouth rose, slow and knowing. Bailey took it for admiration, or decided it would serve him better to pretend he had. He winked at her, a small movement meant to pass for charm and spoiled by the satisfaction behind it. Kate released a thin stream of smoke through her nose. The faint sound accompanying it was not quite laughter. It cut deeper than laughter would have. Doc said nothing. His face offered no more information than the dark backs of his cards. He might have held a pair. He might have held nothing. His thumb rested lightly over the lowest card, covering its corner. Bailey leaned back, His chair gave a small complaint beneath his weight. Satisfaction tugged at one side of his mouth. Doc regarded the 4 aces. He placed the 2 of clubs on the table, then the 3. He adjusted the second card until its edge aligned perfectly with the first, taking the care of a dentist setting a delicate instrument into place. The 4 of clubs followed. Bailey's smile remained, but the skin around it had begun to tighten. The man on his left stopped pretending to study the cards he had folded. Doc laid down the 5. The murmur died. Every ace in the deck sat beneath Bailey's hands. Every man at the table understood what remained possible, and how little room possibility had left. Bailey's eyes fixed on the final card beneath Doc's thumb. The satisfaction went out of his face. Doc kept his fingertips resting on the card. He looked first at the man on Bailey's left, who found sudden interest in the beer stains on the table, then at the man on Bailey's right, whose gaze remained fixed on the pot he had expected to share. Only then did Doc look at Bailey. He turned the card over slowly. The 6 of clubs settled beside the 5. Straight flush. 5 clubs in sequence. The only kind of hand that could beat Bailey's 4 aces. For a moment, nothing in the room moved, except the smoke. Then the silence collapsed into a groan from somewhere behind Doc. A man near the bar breathed out a low curse. Another laughed once in disbelief, then thought better of it. Bailey made no sound. His smile remained, after everything supporting it had disappeared. It held for another second, then stiffened with the rest of him. His eyes dropped to Doc's hand, traveled to the ashtray, and moved at last to the men seated beside him. Neither returned the look. Doc lifted the cigarette and drew from it. Smoke left his nose in 2 thin streams as he eased back in his chair. He rested one wrist beside the pot, his hand loose and plainly visible. His shoulders stayed relaxed. His chin rose by the smallest degree. He held Bailey's eyes. There was no smile in it, no threat Bailey could point to, nothing a man could repeat later without admitting what had happened. Only mild, courteous patience, and all the time in the world for Bailey to object. Bailey's jaw shifted once beneath the moustache. His hands remained flat on the table. No accusation came. He could name Doc's trick only by inviting questions about his own. Doc gathered the pot without haste, drawing coins and chips toward him in smooth, unhurried passes. The cigarette remained between 2 fingers, its ash long and grey, bending under its own weight, but refusing to fall. He collected the last coin before reaching toward the tray and tapping the ash free. "You see?" Kate said. "My man makes a diagnosis, wins the pot, and never even drops his ash. Very talented." Laughter moved through the room, uneven but welcome, easing some of the pressure Bailey had laid across it. Bailey stood. He rose without haste, pushing his chair back just far enough to clear it. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not need to. The size of him, the set of his shoulders, and the deliberate way he planted both feet carried enough possibility. The laughter thinned and died. Wilbur's grin vanished. His hand slipped below the table, uncertain but ready. Nick remained seated, though every trace of amusement left his eyes as they settled on Bailey's hands. Behind the bar, Hawk shifted his weight and lowered one shoulder, bringing his right hand closer to the shotgun beneath the counter. Bailey stared at Doc. Doc stayed where he was, one wrist resting beside the reclaimed pot, his cigarette held loosely between 2 fingers. He returned the look with calm, almost courteous attention. Bailey's gaze slid toward Kate. She met it through the smoke, one brow lifting slightly. His mouth hardened beneath the moustache. He looked once more at Doc. "Come on, boys." The 2 men rose with him. The one on Bailey's left glanced at the pot before catching himself. The other avoided looking at anyone as they followed Bailey toward the doors. Wilbur tracked them across the room. Nick watched Bailey's hands until they disappeared from sight. Hawk did not straighten until the doors swung shut behind all 3 men. Silence held for another moment. A chair scraped near the wall. Someone at the bar picked up a glass and drank. Conversation returned in low, separate strands, rather than all at once, each voice testing the room before trusting it again. Cecil watched the doors settle. He glanced toward Hawk, then Nick, taking their ease as confirmation that the danger had passed. Only then did he adjust one cuff, reclaim his injured dignity, and incline his head toward Kate. "Yes, Mrs. Holliday, your husband enjoys an excellent reputation, and I accept his diagnosis without reservation. My disappointment is not scientific, it is spiritual." "Spiritual disappointment is harder to diagnose," Kate said, taking a drag from her cigarette. "And harder to charge for." The line drew a few smiles, and a quiet chuckle from somewhere behind Samantha. The room continued knitting itself together around them. Samantha's own smile lingered, but her gaze returned to Kate. Kate looked back. Her smile came slowly, as though she too had reached an answer. Samantha returned it. Nick turned back toward Wilbur, his grin returning. "Go on, Wilbur. What else you got?" Cecil leaned forward. "Mr. Ryder, I warn you, if you encourage him, I shall hold you responsible for the physician's bill and whatever sedatives are required to restore me afterward." Wilbur grinned. Right. There were these monkeys.